Lorenzo, when preparing this speech for you, I realized that we don't know each other so well. I got to know you better and better throughout the years. And frankly, by rereading last night your motivation letter for becoming a professor at ISS, I must say I got to know you even better. I want to highlight here 3 points that did strike me in that letter. It started, and of course I would say, with the All Eyes on the Amazon project, focusing on deforestation, environmental degradation in the Amazon, in Ecuador and Peru, a collaboration with HIFOS, with Greenpeace, the coordination of indigenous organizations of the Amazon Basin, and many other, almost 30 other international and local organizations, including ISS, including you and including Murat. It's an impressive list of partners who participated in that program or project. The dream of the project is so nicely stated on the website, is to protect the Amazon rainforest by defending the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And I think that says it all. Says it all about the project. But I also feel it also says all about you. Doing academic work on an urgent societal challenge, climate change, critical social science perspective, starting first from the local communities and indigenous people, and focusing on defending their rights and their empowerment with the use of new technologies, in your case the drones, so that people themselves can control their own living environment. That and the many also artistic expressions in the project, I feel it also describes you well. I watched the film, the videos made on All Eyes on the Amazon earlier already, and I watched you doing your fieldwork with the local community, and that gave me a great idea who you are in the field, and what your engagement is and what you stand for. And that image is still staying strongly in my mind, because I could see you doing the work. This documentary, I learned also in your letter, received several awards, and one of them is, most important, the Amnesty International Italy Award. And the evaluation by the committee members and the words that the evaluation committee did right there, you can be very proud of that. I'm not sure if everyone here in the ISS community or in the room did know that, actually, Lorenzo. So it's good to bring that to the forefront. Reading further in your motivation letter for the professorship, I myself didn't know that you worked in Vietnam a lot. It was before I came to ISS, and that you developed the teaching programs and research in both Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City further. And also something I didn't know, that you received a medal for that from the Vietnamese Ministry of Education and Training, if I'm right. I don't know whether everyone did know that. We get to know you better, Lorenzo. And I learned that besides Italy, of course, Peru, Ecuador, Vietnam, you also worked in Bhutan, USA, other European countries. Maybe I'm forgetting some of them. And recently also Indonesia has been added to the projects that you're going to work. Many of the projects you did and you do together with Murat. And this week Murat told me and Arjun actually that many people still confuse you. And they say Murat to you and Lorenzo to Murat. It's very special to see you working so much together and being such a good working couple. A third last example that I want to take from your motivation letter, illustrating that I got to know you better through this letter, is the work that you do with the Ethics Committee since 2018 as a chair. And the narrative that you provided in the letter was quite nice to read about the importance of ethics and how to do that in a proper way, in a very facilitating way. And also remarked, well, the work has to be done locally in the faculties and not centrally. And that's, of course, what it really is about. But I liked reading that, and I got to know you better on that as well. All this together made that recently IB has asked you to formulate a plan for the next Prince Claus chair, who will work with us from September 23 onwards, and who will focus on climate change, technology, and citizen science, topic that fits you very well. Of course, you will work with the new Prince Claus chair, still to be selected and still to be defined, also the selection committee and the program. You will work with ISS colleagues and colleagues from other universities, as the prerequisite is of the Prins Claus Chair. Lorenzo, I'm very happy that with your professorship, research, teaching, engagement, societal relevance on climate change gets an extra boost and an extra space at ISS, together with other academicians working on that. I wish you good luck and success in your professorship, and I look forward to hear more in your inaugural lecture. And I'm also looking forward to get to learn you even a bit more in the coming years to come. Good luck to you. Happy that you're here. Professor Allier, up to you.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this laudatio. And of course, I know Lorenzo Pellegrini and his work, and he's trained as an economist, although he's gone into other aspects of reality. And you are now, I wrote, when I was writing this, that now you are in el mezzo de tua vita academica, not the vita fisica, but the vita academica, with about 20 years behind you, and at least we hope 20 years in front of more. And your wave has not been smarrito at all. I think it's been good up to now, and the future is brilliant, I think. You have 20 years of publication, as I said, with your thesis at the Free University of Amsterdam, and now as a full professor of the Erasmus University of Rotterdam, and at this institute, which I know for many years, and which is becoming ever more famous and more fantastic in a way, in its interdisciplinarity and in the relevance of what you do. I know the origins, remote origins, a bit colonial perhaps still, and the reality now which is so different. And I think I have now revived again or looked again at your first writings on corruption in Kiklos, one of the first articles, which was at the time a famous journal in economics in Basel, and then a book which was the thesis, and then on forestry in Pakistan and Honduras and Nicaragua and many other countries. And corruption, I want to say, it's about, I am very ignorant academically, but it's a great theme. And it was very good of you at a young age to choose corruption, because corruption is growing still, isn't it? So it's good for your past, and can be good even for your future as a topic of study. And now you have seen, sometimes in your last articles, you are doing both things, study of corruption, or some instances of greenwashing, one could say, transparency, so-called, and so on, linked to your second theme, which is natural resources in the global south, or the ecology of the global south. On corruption, I want to say something, because as I said, I am really ignorant, but I remember when I worked in Cuba sometime, and Cuba was a famous president in 1910 or so, after so-called independence, but of course the US was ruling Cuba, and this president was very corrupt, and he acknowledged it, and he said, "El tiburón se baña, pero salpica." So say, I'm very corrupt, but I give a little bit to all my people. And he was called Menocal. And then I thought there was a theory of corruption at the time saying when some people are powerful economically, as the US was at the time, of course, in Cuba, but not politically, because Cuba was nominally independent, then this is a very good setting for corruption. And this was my theory of corruption at the time, but I never developed this, and I have always been curious about what can economists and social scientists say about corruption, which is so prevalent in so many places in the world. So you work on corruption, and then you move to natural resources in the global south, as one of your papers explains, and sometimes on both topics together. But you have worked in Bolivia a lot, in Ecuador, in Peru, but also in India. Now you have students, I think, in Congo, and you have published something about the Congo and Rwanda, and also in Asia, in Vietnam, in Pakistan, in India. And in the last few years, you have been publishing like 5 articles in good journals every year, which is quite a lot. I am not surprised that you have been named a food professor. It was really very well deserved. And I want to refer again, as the rector did, to your work in the Amazon on the extractive industries. And we have another point in common, is that the issue of the Yasuni ITT proposal in Ecuador, which I lived very closely to it for some years, which was lasted for about 2007 to 2013, until the president of Ecuador gave it up. And you explained in one of your interviews, I think, or articles, that when you were at the top of the Tiputini Tower in the biological park, and the Yasuni ITT proposal was about leaving about 850 million barrels of oil underground. I hope I'm not stepping into your lecture. And this was a very good idea, because it would avoid local damage to the biology, local damage to the indigenous people, and also a lot of emissions of carbon dioxide at the end, like half a year of German emissions, we calculated at the time. This failed, but the idea has not failed, it has continued. I'm thinking about you and Tiputini. A few days ago I read that Yasuni was called the Yasuni ITT project. The TT meant Tiputini and Tambococha, isn't it? And then the I was the Ispingo field. Well, quite recently, a Chinese company has started to take the oil from the Ispingo field. So we failed, I mean, we as sympathetic intellectuals to the idea, and in my case, because I knew Acción Ecológica and Alberto Acosta, who was a minister at the time, so we failed, and it was quite hard, this failure. But the idea of leaving fossil fuels underground is obviously growing. It's growing because it's one of the, as you will say, explain, is a supply side view of what must be done in order, if possible, at least to stop the growth in the emissions of carbon dioxide. And your work in the Amazon, as we know, has been already mentioned, is being done in cooperation with indigenous organizations, with new monitoring systems, and has led you quite normally, I think, to another, I don't know, 10, 20 years perhaps, of your personal and intellectual and professional life with so many doctoral students now on this, which is, well, let's hope that it's so successful that there is no need anymore to say that fossil fuels should be left under the ground. But the truth is that this is going to be a very difficult next years we're going to have in the world. And this is a very, at the same time, practical, but innovative way of looking at the real economy, not the economic theory as many economists do, but a very applied, practical economy linked to anthropology and need to cooperation with local people in the countries that you love so much, which are Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador. So congratulations, and thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much for your kind words. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thanks to the rector. Thank you, professors. Thanks, colleagues, students of ISS, audience, people. Welcome to this lecture. I'm going to talk about something quite ambitious today, quite clearly. We talk about imagining the end of fossil capitalism. We think about how we can end this type of economic system we have been into since the Industrial Revolution. And the focus will be on supply-side climate policies, and with the connection also to the social movements, especially, that are fighting this struggle to keep fossil fuels where they are and where they should be, mostly, under the ground. So this is the outline of the lecture. I start by saying, how did we get here? A little bit an intellectual and also a personal story. Then we move on to supply-side climate policies, the what, the why, and the how of making these supply-side climate policies. And then we go back to the big questions of what next, what the future should look like. And of course, I will conclude with some questions. But how did we get here? I will start actually by thanking people. I know typically this comes at the end, but I think it's easier to do it at the beginning. And how did we get here? Of course, we got here thanks to lots of people that worked with me, that collaborated, lots of people that supported me. And I'll just give some examples. Of course, I will forget someone. And I will start with examples by mentioning the three joys of my life, my partner Anna and my kids, la principessa Alba e il gatto Fabio, who are, Anna very often doesn't know exactly what I'm doing because I try to keep my work entirely separate from my family life. She might be puzzled sometimes, but still she's a joy to be with, and I'm very happy to be with her and to go home when she's there. And per voi, per Fabio e per Alba, è una gioia essere con voi, avervi vicino, e sono sempre felice di tornare a casa e di trovarvi. And I will say a few other things in Italian, and then we move on to English, because of course there is my father, mio padre, che mi ha visto andare in Olanda diversi anni fa, forse senza capire tanto bene perché partivo per fare un dottorato di ricerca così lontano, ma insieme a mia madre mi è sempre stato vicino e di supporto. Grazie papà. And of course my sisters and their kids, the family, my friends from Amsterdam, Ancona and elsewhere, who make me feel at home. I'll mention Andrea, Sabrina, Luke, Susan, Guido, Samuel, most of them are here. And then the support I had from my colleagues, especially from my research program, and I will mention Arjun, Eliseo, and Matthias. And then there is Murat, with whom I shared many adventures, many academic activities, and we sometimes get mixed up one with the other. That's quite amazing for us. And everybody seems to think that we always agree. Well, we have furious discussions, and in fact, we disagree with most things. But in a way, this worked out, I think, intellectually as a good partnership. And then, of course, there are also former colleagues like Luca Tasciotti or Marti Horta Martinez. We worked together many years ago in this institute, and we still work together on several projects. And of course, this is one step out of an intellectual history. I mentioned it already earlier this morning. I was a very unhappy student of economics. I decided to study economics because I wanted to learn about inequality, about injustice, about environmental problems, and we didn't cover much of this in my neoclassical economics standard degree. And when I was writing my thesis, I was introduced to the work of Professor Martinez-Sallier, who really was instrumental to get me excited about economics again, and especially about ecological economics. And of course, we meet always new colleagues like Alessandra Curio at her Inaugural just 2 weeks ago, who presented a fascinating lecture about the perverse side of globalization law. And of course, I will not refer directly to that work, but tackling that perversion, straightening things with the globalization law is also part of the story here. I'll thank also my students, of course, the PhD students, like Vincenzo gave me a book that inspired the title of this lecture, or Fergus, who always asks uncomfortable questions, and my master's students that I keep meeting when I go, even after 10 years they have graduated. So these are all the thankings, and we have also I have something to say about the environmental justice organizations I work with, in particular UDAP, the Union of People Affected by Texaco Chevron, and the FDA, the Frente de Defensa de la Amazonía, We have been partners for more than 10 years. They've been fundamental for me in gaining a deep knowledge about well, environmental injustice in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Then there has been a process of getting closer to home, to the place I come from when it comes to research. Most recently, I started to do research also in Italy, and there to partner with a great environmental justice organization called Cova Contro. We also co-author papers together with Andrea, with Mimmo, with Giorgio. This is a very exciting collaboration for me to study then problems related to oil extraction in southern Italy and to see the kind of similarities that emerge with the work and with the issues we see rising in Ecuador and in Peru. And even getting closer to home, my parents live in a house where I stayed for almost 20 years that has a beautiful view over a gulf, the Gulf of Ancona, and on the other side you can see up for 60 kilometers. At night, very often you can see a torch, and that's a torch of a refinery. When we see environmental justice struggles in the global south, we actually start to see them everywhere if we start to be careful. We start to see them, and I started the research in Ecuador, Peru, in Bolivia, and then I find them in southern Italy. Of course, you can think about Groningen, and I will mention one case that is the struggle concerning the refinery in the town of Falconara. This refinery is in the middle of the attention for several reasons and for several impacts that are related to its operations. And we see a struggle where we have frontline environmental rights defenders that then get into trouble for what they are doing. And I'm referring to the case of Roberto Cenci that appeared in a news item where he mentioned that there have been several accidents in this refinery, and that there have been results of epidemiological studies that show that there is increased morbidity and morbidity in the town where this refinery is located. For this, he has been sued by the refinery, by the company that manages the refinery, and he has decided to he decided to step down from the city council of the city. I'm told I should be careful when I talk about this refinery. They suggested to Roberto that they could come to an agreement if he would pay them 200,000 euros in compensation. So I will be careful with what I say next. I'll just say that there has been an investigation for environmental disaster by the prosecutors, illicit waste management, contamination, personal injury, since an accident that took place in 2018. And in July 2022, the environmental police concluded a preliminary investigation finding evidence related to the violation of environmental regulations and the specifics of the authorizations that the refinery had to operate. And I cite here, what the environmental police found was serious structural deficiencies in the plant, with the uncontrolled and prolonged emission in the ecosystem of pollutants that are dangerous for the environment and for humans. And there is much more in that document. And this lecture is also part of the campaign to support Roberto Cenci and to ensure that environmental rights defenders don't have to face this kind of situations. I met Roberto yesterday, I met Roberto yesterday, and I look forward to meet him in person. I'm happy to be part of the campaign to support him. And I will come back to this towards the end of the lecture when I talk about what academia can do for and together with social movements to stop corporate social irresponsibility. Okay, climate change. This is the way greenhouse gas emissions have been evolving in the last 20 years. we went from emissions slightly above 30 billion tons or gigatons in 1990, and in 2020 they were around 50 billion tons. I'm not going to ask you to remember many numbers during these lectures, but remember this one, 50 billion tons or 50 gigatons per year. As you can see, emissions are actually increasing over time. So we are in a situation where greenhouse gas equivalent emissions have not peaked. On the contrary, they are increasing on a year-by-year basis. To avoid dramatic climate change we will see later, we would see this line going dramatically down. Instead, we see it still rising. And we can look at climate change at greenhouse gas emissions in many ways, and we can think about where these emissions come from. We can think about agriculture, waste, industry, but actually the large share of these is caused by energy. And the cause of emissions in the energy sector is basically from the combustion of fossil fuels. So when we are talking about greenhouse gas emissions, we are mostly talking about emissions that are generated by the combustion of fossil fuels. When we talk about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, we are talking about a problem that is rooted in fossil fuels. And this is the way fossil fuel emissions have evolved over time. This is a longer view. So I've shown you earlier from the 1990s, this is from the Industrial Revolution, but just focus maybe in the period from 1950 to 2020. Here you cannot see the Kyoto Protocol. You cannot see the Paris Agreement. The only times we see a small inflection, it's because of a crisis. So these have been the only points in time when you see a small decrease in a very clearly increasing trend. So, of course, the Second World War, the oil crisis in the 70s, the global financial crisis in 1982, the global financial crisis in 2008, and then the pandemic in 2020-21. These are the only episodes that caused a temporary decrease in the emissions on a year-to-year basis. And I think this should give us, in a way, should motivate us to think about the urgency of the problem. We are in a situation where we emit 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year, and this increases on a year-by-year basis. In 2022, we will emit more than 2021, and probably in 2023, we will emit more than in 2022. This is what should happen instead to investment, because of course what drives these emissions is the investments that economies, fossil fuel companies are doing into expanding their production. And this is what we have as a roadmap to net zero emissions. Basically, in the year after, well, since the next decade, there should be no investment anymore in new fossil fuel exploration projects, because of course these are projects that have a long time, that have a long lifespan. Now, we put all of these together with the idea of the carbon budget. Since the global temperature the global temperature rise is closely related to cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions, the remaining carbon budget is the total amount of CO2 emissions that should not be exceeded to limit average global warming to a desired temperature. And the best estimates, and these are of course just rough estimates, are that for a probability of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, the remaining carbon budget from 2020 onwards is around 440 gigatons. We remember that we are emitting 50 gigatons per year. So we basically are burning a budget that will be completed by the end of this, will be depleted by the end of this decade. If we are confident with the 2 degrees, the level of global warming, if compared to pre-industrial levels, we have a little, well, we have 2 decades and a half to reduce emissions to zero. So there is reason to panic. This is, of course, hugely important. What we used to think is something that is a danger for the next generations, etc. It's something that we live, we see in our own lives, and we are actually in the middle of a crash, and we are speeding up. So that's a problem, to say the least. When we think about the future, we can try to see where investment is going. And this is one of the examples of looking at how the future is going to look like. And there has been this really interesting study by Kuhne and co-authors about so-called carbon bombs. These are large projects that have the potential of emitting more than 1 gigaton per project. Here you see that there are, for coal, a total of 230 projects, such projects, and that the potential emissions associated with these projects are already basically exceeding the total carbon budget. And this doesn't include the projects with oil and gas that are even, have embedded even more potential emissions. We are talking about 646 gigatons. And these are investments that are taking place. And in fact, if we only look at new potential emissions, we think about new projects in coal. They contain 225, they embed 225 gigatons of CO2 emissions, and oil and gas, the new ones, 193. So not only the existing projects have more than enough gigatons of potential emissions to exceed the carbon budget. In fact, we are planning to do more. And I find it quite obvious that this is a problem. I hope you will agree with me, because I've been insisting now for several minutes to give you this dramatic picture. This is a problem, and it is a problem that is being only very recently acknowledged. In fact, in the words of Antonio Guterres in 2022, the Secretary General of the United Nations, climate activists are sometimes portrayed as dangerous radicals, but the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing production of fossil fuels. Investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. This is what he declared in April 2022. Of course, I wonder why he forgot to mention that a big actor here are fossil fuel companies. It's not only countries. I mean, the real actors that make the investment decisions are the fossil fuel companies. And he's not the only one to have noticed this madness. And in April 2021, 101 Nobel laureates endorsing the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty have signed a letter saying that the solution is clear. Fossil fuels must be kept in the ground. So that's excellent. Of course, it's here there is somebody that is missing. That's the Nobel Prize in Economics, Nordhaus, who won a Nobel Prize for studying climate change. Somehow he's not among the signatories. But of course, other people have noticed the problem of this extraction of fossil fuels even earlier. And I'm thinking about Greta Thunberg, that with her typical clarity said repeatedly that fossil fuels must be kept in the ground in several ways, in several occasions, and I think really with a gift for clarity. But we can go back further, and we find again in this case, Nimo Bassey from Nigeria, the head of environmental rights action, Friends of the Earth Nigeria, that in 2007 coined the slogan of leaving fossil fuels in the soil. And he was referring in particular to oil extraction in Nigeria. It's an idea that was actually coming from Ecuador already in the 1990s, promoted by one of those social movements that Professor Martinez Aliés mentioned earlier, Acción Ecológica, a fantastic example of popular environmentalism. And it's an idea that traveled to Nigeria, was made into a concrete policy proposal precisely by Nimo Bassey, and then traveled back to Ecuador as a concrete government proposal as put forward by President Rafael Correa, who asked to the international community to compensate for some of the revenues that Ecuador would be missing by avoiding extraction of fossil fuels, and in exchange he would commit to preserve the fossil fuel stock in the Yasuni ITT blocks. In that way, it would also not only contribute to the fight to climate change, but also there would be collateral benefits, since this is one of the global hotspots for biodiversity. It's an area lived by indigenous people, including people in voluntary isolation. So from these social movements, you see ideas that then get captured and become actual policy proposals. They inspire the work of academics, and I think, in fact, when we come to the idea of keeping fossil fuels on the ground, we have to acknowledge that we are facing some of an example of having activists, scholarly activists, if you like, as June Boras has called them, promoting ideas, creating concepts for sustainability that then get popularized by policymakers, by academics, and I think that's something we have to acknowledge. So there is this problem that we continue to extract and we continue to consume, to combust all these fossil fuels, and at the same time we have a policy sphere where the overwhelming majority of policy interventions are only about the consumption of fossil fuels. So when we see, for example, the Kyoto Protocol or the United Nations Framework Convention for Combating Climate Change, it's all about reducing emissions. In fact, when we think about, reducing emissions by reducing consumption. In fact, when we think about typical policies, climate policies like taxation of fossil fuels, emission standards, whether they are economic interventions like tradable permits, or regulatory interventions like, for example, mileage standards for cars, they are all to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels. There are very, very few cases of multinational initiatives, policies, that actually target not the consumption of fossil fuels, but also the supply of fossil fuels. And my hypothesis here is that, in fact, these policies are complementary and synergic. And on top of that, supply-side policies have also qualities of themselves that are not manifest in demand-side climate policies. So when we think about supply-side climate policies, we can think again about economic instruments, but then the taxation, for example, for fossil fuels wouldn't be at the consumption point. So if we think about gasoline, that's where you pay the taxes when you buy the gasoline from the gas station. We can think about economic instruments that are applied at the oil well head. So the taxation takes place in the place at the location where oil is being extracted. And the same we can think about tradable permits. If we have, in fact, a carbon budget, and we know that the carbon budget translates in only so many giga barrels of oil, you could have a tradable permit regime where you have to buy a permit to extract the oil, and you have precisely a limit that is identical to the carbon budget. Or we could think about regulation interventions as they have been put forward, firstly, of course, by social movements in terms of moratoria, so temporary suspensions of fossil fuel activities in terms of exploration and extraction. We can think about total bans, so at indeterminate level, or we can think about hybrid forms where maybe we stop and we try to defuse certain of the carbon bombs that are already operational with economic instruments, and at the same time there is a prohibition to start new projects. So there is lots of ways in which we can think about policies that address directly the supply of fossil fuels. And these are policies that are very different from the ones you have seen so far promoted by the international community. At the very basic level, and here I want to motivate why I think it's important to have this supply-side intervention next to demand-side interventions. At the very basic level, policies to control the demand or supply of fossil fuels are equivalent. So if you have a stringent regulatory regime that decreases the demand for fossil fuels, well, extra fossil fuels are not going to be produced. Obviously, as you have seen in the graph I started with, we don't have such a regulatory regime. And actually, if we look at the features of these demand and supply side policies, I think they really lend themselves to generate complementarities and synergies. On the one hand, supply side policies have a characteristic that they are very, very concrete and politically, the potential to be politically galvanizing. We are talking about certain oil concessions, very specific open pit mines of coal, potential or existing. They are really interventions on which you can picture a geographical location which is undergoing a transformation or will live through a transformation if a policy is not enacted, a supply-side climate policy is not enacted. So by giving this concrete dimension to this type of policies, you can actually have a galvanizing effect and have these policies interact with the social movements that have been promoting interventions like this already without maybe having climate change as a primary focus in the first place. And together, this can also help to change the norms. So the norms, of course, we have a stigmatizing effect when you have rules that are enacted to decrease demand. Let's think about fly shaming, for example, which is something that we have been exposed to. And of course, we would like to see similar norms arising from the extraction side. So feeling uncomfortable to be a member of a government who promotes, for example, further new projects in areas that are being explored. The supply-side policies also have the feature that they can be agreed only by fossil fuel producers, by large ones, and studying things like, studying items like carbon bombs give you a clear dimension on which countries you have to engage with. And clearly, this will make us also uncomfortable because some of these countries are less than perfect democracies, to say the least. They include countries in the Middle East. They include countries in, such as Russia that have many carbon bombs that are activated or that are in the making. And these are countries that somehow we would have to convince to leave fossil fuels where they are. On the contrary of demand policies, supply-side policies are also easier to monitor. So it's easier to see if, for example, infrastructure to extract oil is being constructed rather than evaluate alternative scenarios of consumption under different circumstances. And there is, of course, lots of claims that there are frauds in the consumption side analysis of what happens with single interventions. Another issue, and this is really related to demand policies, is that supply side policies solve to some extent or ameliorate the so-called green paradox. The green paradox is what happens when demand policies that are effective, they are decreasing the consumption for and the demand of fossil fuels, and the right holders on those fossil fuels act in anticipation of this declining demand and as a consequence declining prices for fossil fuels, and they decide to anticipate the extraction and to expand the extraction ahead of time to enjoy higher prices, and there is a race to the bottom. Supply side also act as an insurance if, as it's the case, demand interventions fail. You can think the other set of interventions can act as an insurance, and together they ensure, they confirm that there is commitment by the international community to really do something about climate change, to leave fossil fuels where they are, and as such they will be taken into account into investment decisions and for technological choices that otherwise are going to create infrastructures that are carbon dependent and fossil fuel dependent. And a corollary, of course, is that supply side climate policies also directly tackle the issue of stranded assets. So the fact that there are lots of investments that are in the making, and if we all of a sudden get serious about climate change, this will become worthless infrastructure. And clearly there will be vested interest resisting those policies that would make them stranded assets. And finally, the supply side climate policies have also the potential to reap directly collateral benefits. We know the literature about the resource curves. That is the evidence that countries that are extracting and are endowed by large amounts of natural resources actually tend to perform subpar in terms of socio-economic development. And of course, by limiting the amount of extraction, you will limit also this resource curves effect, together with other socio-environmental liabilities. So the type of pollution that we experience when we visit sites where fossil fuels are being extracted, transported, or processed. And for example, that's exactly what we see now in the Tiputini field in the Yasuni. So a biodiversity hotspot where oil infrastructure is being constructed. So if you would stop oil infrastructure there, not only you would do climate policy, you would do also policy about human rights because of the indigenous people in voluntary isolation, and you would have also policies about biodiversity because it's a biodiversity hotspot. And there are many questions, of course, if we start to talk about leaving fossil fuels underground. The first question that an economist will ask is which fossil fuels could be extracted. So how do you allocate the right to extract? And there have been proposals to base these allocations on ecological depth. So we look at accumulated emissions in the past. Basically, some 50% of them are basically originating in the USA and in the large EU, so which includes the UK. And the question is, and I would question the question, is this the right way to consider the concept of ecological depth? Of course there is a depth because these countries have occupied, have consumed a global good, a common global good. So that's the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb greenhouse gases without producing climate change. But I think the focus should be rather on who is responsible for compensation, if you would have compensation, to keep fossil fuels underground, to pay for adaptation, so to adapt for climate change that is taking place already, and also to finance the transition to sustainable, to renewable resources, which is so important for, especially for developing countries. So I would put the emphasis rather than on the right to extract, that then creates the resource curse and the socio-environmental liabilities, on the duty to contribute to compensation, to adaptation, and to the transition to renewable resources. And this brings me to the topic of compensation. And there are all these reserves that are underground and need to stay there, but there are also countries that have the sovereign right to extract those resources. So the question is, should we pay for these countries to keep them where they are, or for right holders to keep them where they are? Can we afford it, is the first question. And some authors studying the Yasuni ITT initiative have the take-home message that we shouldn't talk about compensation. And actually, I think that the learned lesson is the opposite, that we cannot ask developing countries to really commit to climate policies unless we are also willing to support them. And in fact, I asked the question the other way around: can we afford not to do it? And this came to my mind as in July this year, Congo decided to auction land to oil companies, and there was this statement, our priority is not to save the planet. I think Congo, DRC, has plenty of reasons to keep oil where it is. It's, of course, an example of the resource curse. It's a very problematic place. There are indigenous people, there are people that will suffer, and there are environmental values there. So I think there is plenty. But the question, why aren't we compensated for producing this, I think is a pertinent one. And in fact, together with Marty Horta and also with Murat, we made a back-of-the-envelope calculation by taking the compensation that was asked in the Yasuni ITT proposal and multiplying it for all the reserves that need to be left underground, and we got to the staggering amount of 5.4 trillion US dollars that would be necessary to minimally compensate for all the oil and gas reserves that are unburnable. And this is a huge amount of funds, obviously. But I follow here a dictum by John Maynard Keynes, who said that anything we can afford. And for example, the interventions of the European Union and the US for fighting the pandemic are exactly in this order of magnitude. In fact, the US by themselves spent on war since 2001 to 2020 $6.4 trillion. So they spent more than this fighting war. And we are talking about collecting and generating these kind of revenues at the global level. There are several policy initiatives, and I see I'm running out of time somehow. These initiatives include the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a very serious commitment to reduce dramatically the production of fossil fuels. There is the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, the Powering Past Coal Alliance, and we have lots of individual countries that are enacting moratoria and bans. In fact, what we might be seeing in some regions of the world at least is a turn in the tide. So we think about having for the first time the president of a country like Colombia that puts in the program before the elections a policy to stop further exploration and expansion of fossil fuels extraction in the country. Not only this is important in itself, 2002 Costa Rica was the first country in Latin America to enact this type of ban, but for the country, for Colombia, this is a break with the past of extractive imperative and consensus that extraction is conducive to local development. Now you have a situation where a president can be elected on the basis of a promise that extraction will not take place. And I think these are very, very encouraging news. So these are great steps forwards Just the day before yesterday, the President Lasso of Ecuador announced a one-year-long moratorium on new projects in the Amazon for oil and gas extraction. That's great news. Of course, it's only 1 year, hardly enough to make a difference, but it's a big change from for a president who came to power saying that he wanted to double production in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And at the same time, we have to recognize, and I could say the same about Boric in Chile, etc., but I have to hurry up. There are also steps backwards, and I'm afraid I come from a country which in 2019 banned new oil and gas exploration projects, and then the ban has expired in 2022. So that's the case of Italy, and that's why we need serious commitment, and we need social movements to keep up the pressure on the governments so that they stick to these moratoria and bans. To conclude, and here I was inspired, of course, by reading Capitalism, Realism of Mark Fisher. He says, citing Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I, of course, paraphrased it to say that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of fossil fuels. We are talking about, indeed, a challenge, a change of the type of civilization we are used to, because fossil fuels are everywhere, and they have powered capitalism since the Second World War. They, in fact, coincided with the rise of capitalism. And fossil fuel realism, again citing, paraphrasing Mark Fisher, discourages us from thinking and articulating alternatives to fossil fuel capitalism. Fossil fuel played a defining role in the Industrial Revolution, leading to the advance of real existing capitalism. In fact, cheap and abundant energy underpins the process of sustained economic growth. And that is a process that started with the Industrial Revolution, and it's still ongoing. I will conclude with some questions, asking the question of whether renewable varieties of capitalism are a possibility. So could we see forms of capitalism that give up inexpensive sources of energy and still are capitalistic, even though we are talking about respecting hard limits like a carbon budget? Or the next question is, shall we think more radically about alternatives that are imaginable, acknowledging limits and organizing social mechanisms to satisfy basic social environmental rights? And I'm thinking about the work, of course, of Georges Korogan, but more recently also the work on degrowth and conviviality. And finally, and I come back to the issue of, that I started with the issue of the refinery, we as academics play a role not only asking the questions, but also supporting those social movements that are already providing the answers ahead of time. And we need to engage with them, study corporate social responsibility, and make it more likely that fossil fuel companies are held accountable. Oh, I'm going the wrong way because I had only thank you to say. Thank you very much.